What's up, everybody? Let's go around the horn, if you will. Gene Williams, founder and administrator of Warchant.com, joining us. Ira Schofel, managing editor of Warchant.com, and senior writer Corey Clark, all in the house. All of us work for Warchant.com. Well, Gene owns the thing. Use the promo code WARCHANT30 for 30 free days of access to the ultimate Seminoles sports source. Gentlemen, we've been getting together about once a week talking about the pressing issues in the entire college football landscape. We talked about fans in the stands, and now it seems like traction starting to build. The momentum continues to go in the direction of a football season being played. Plenty of schools around the nation announced that they'll be returning on their campuses here in the coming weeks. We know that the SEC, June 8th is their target date. Clemson, Louisville have announced they'll be back June 8th. So when these schools do get back to working out, we obviously know there's probably going to be a little bit of a different sort of rhythm to their preseason practices, if you will, Gene. But ultimately, with this layoff, without having a spring practice, I mean, it'd probably be tough to say that this is somehow a net positive for a program like Florida State. But with this layoff, with the way the schedule is going to probably work out, how does it sort of position Florida State and Mike Norvell and this new staff? And will they be maybe at a disadvantage or maybe an advantage somehow when everything does return?
Yeah, I don't know how you can couch it being an advantage. That would be tough. I mean, it's as I wrote about in the companion piece that you can look at Warchant.com, it's called a learning curve for a reason. I mean, the more you're exposed to the coaching, you're doing the reps in practice, you go into meetings, the quicker you're going to pick up the system. I mean, it is what it is. In Florida State, with a new coaching staff and a new system and everything else in place, it's not a good scenario for Florida State right now. They would have, if they could have got that spring practice, and that would have been invaluable to Florida State. So yes, it is a disadvantage, but what I want to say is what the positive is what we've been able to gather from our interactions with him and from what we've heard from other people is Mike Norvell, and that is the attention to detail and the organizational skills. And I think when you're in a situation you've got to cram effectively for just a handful of weeks to get ready for the season, I think he's of the mindset where he can get the most out of his players in a short amount of time because he's so well organized. And I'm sure all these couple months of this hiatus, he's been planning diligently to get ready for this situation. It's just like, we've all been in a situation. I know probably Corey more than most, that he didn't go to class. He didn't,
right.
He didn't take copious notes when he was in class. But I'm sure at some point you have to cram for an exam. And that's kind of what Florida State's at when they're going to have this preseason practice schedule. Norvell and the staff are going to have to cram. No, I've done it too. Sometimes it doesn't work, but sometimes, I've crammed. I've done okay in a final exam. So it might be like that. If Norvell's able to get these guys really efficient and speed things up and get a lot of stuff done in a short amount of time, they still could be in pretty good shape. But they're definitely right now, they're playing at a little bit of a disadvantage just by, having several months where they've been out of it.
Strong metaphor, Gene. You probably scored really high on your SAT verbal, I would imagine. Ira, so with the layoff, the gap obviously exists between Florida State and Clemson, Ohio State, Oklahoma, Alabama. Oklahoma, oddly enough, has said they're going to wait till July to get their workout started. But this gap, real or perceived, between those sort of programs in Florida State where they want to get to, has it widened with this layoff and this layover?
I mean, it's definitely not ideal. I mean, when you're talking about a program that was already playing pretty mediocre to below average football for the last three seasons, where they've been under 500 basically over the last three years, to bring in a new coaching staff and then to only get 3 spring practices. Yeah, that's a problem to put in a new system and everything else. The biggest problem, though, may not even be the installation process. I do think they've gotten one nice thing that the NCAA has given these schools this time this summer. First it was 4 hours a week, then it went to 8 hours a week, where they were able to work and actually coach and teach virtually. They could actually kind of pull up Zoom or get on PowerPoints and things like that and actually implement, teach the system. That's a positive. That's something that will help a little bit. I think the biggest problem, though, to be honest with you, is you've got the evaluation time that you get in spring practice. That's missing. And so the coaches, the time they got to watch these players, to see how they reacted to different situations, when they had a good day of practice, when they had a bad day of practice, FSU's coaches are going to be learning all of that on the fly in preseason as opposed to learning it in the spring, which is a big deal. And I think, to me, that's the biggest. I think they'll be able to install their offense, their defense, get all their checks in and all those things. But I think learning how the players respond to adversity and how they handle competition, to me, that's something they're not going to be able to replace very easily.
Corey, we always talk about, or at least I talk about how, complicated I think football is, and you wish you had all this time to practice and prepare and could never have enough of it. Will 2020 sort of underscore just how important it is for teams to have plenty of practice, or will we find out that, to Gene's point, that you can cram and maybe actually wind up on the right side of things?
Yeah, no, the more practice time, the better. Especially, when Gene was talking, I thought Florida State's at a disadvantage. If you just have if Florida State's schedule was made up of only teams with first-year head coaches, I think Florida State might go undefeated. That's how much I believe in Norvell. I think compared to other first-year coaches, he's going to have his program in much better position to deal with this and play. The problem is that's not the case. So they're at a decided disadvantage to the other schools on the schedule that have more stability and have more consistency within the program. But yeah, any amount of extra practices they can get is a big deal, especially a first-year program. I think you could, I think with maybe somebody that's been established for 4 or 5 years in a program, there could be diminishing returns if you have those 2 extra weeks of practice in the preseason. But if you're able to get some sort of extra practice time, the NCAA gives you some, that won't help. That won't make up for the spring practice that you missed, but it will make up a little bit. And like Ira said, maybe you can use those first week or 2 weeks to evaluate what you have on your roster. So then when you're starting to get ready and starting to really prepare for West Virginia, who's on your depth chart, who you can count on and who you can't. These guys haven't been able to see these guys in person. They've gotten to see film. They've gotten to see them in off-season workouts, but they don't know how they respond to a great practice or tough coaching. And that's what they really missed out of spring practice. So if you can get the more you can get of that, of coach-player evaluation, coach-player relationships, and understanding who's on your roster, the better it is.
Yeah, and I'll just to interrupt real quick. We don't know yet whether or not they're going to get those 2 weeks.
Right.
It came out last week that the NCAA is considering it. I think the Football Oversight Committee is going to recommend that all colleges get an extra 2 weeks of preseason, basically a 6-week preseason, which creates some other issues. I mean, you do have to manage your roster, to load management, not get guys hurt during 6 weeks of practice, and that would be a grind. But I think it's something that's needed. I mean, there are some schools out there that got up to a week and a half of spring practice before things got shut down. FSU had 3 practices with a first-year coaching staff, putting in new systems on both sides of the ball. They desperately need those 6 weeks. If that happens, I think is it going to close the gap or give them a chance to? Probably not, but it would be a huge addition for a school like Florida State.
Gene, do you think that's a step in a good direction to at least give some sort of clarity and give this staff a bit of a roadmap to figure things out, the additional 2 weeks if it does come to fruition?
I mean, again, to Ira's point, I think absolutely. If they don't, it's almost a slap in the face if you don't. Why wouldn't you? Everybody had their spring practice cut short. Some schools had no spring practice. Florida State had 3. But you can't just throw these kids in and go, you got to be ready in a few weeks. I mean, they've got to give them some extra time. So I think absolutely the minimum there should be those 2 weeks. And yeah, of course, that's going to help Florida State. Again, going back to the analogy of cramming for a test, if you get another few hours to cram for the test, I mean, it's going to help you. But it all comes down to how efficient can you be? How can you manage those extra minutes, those extra hours? Can you get enough energy drinks in there to keep you up all night to be able to do it? Whatever they got to do. But, it's probably not going to be a fun – if it ends up being 6 weeks for these kids, it's not going to be a fun 6 weeks. And that's the challenge on the coaching staff. How do they keep these kids engaged? Like Ira said, the load management. How do you keep them, basically minimizing the risk of injury? How do you keep them, engaged for that whole 6 weeks to maximize their performance when they open that first game against West Virginia? I mean, that's a big challenge for the coaching staff. But the positive is, if we're reading Mike Norvell the way we think we're reading him, and this is where he excels, Florida State for first-year coaches, as to Corey's point, for first-year coaches, Florida State will be an advantage there.
Corey, we've talked about on the podcast, and you're not going to be in the war room, but I mean, how do you think 6 weeks will be divvied up? I mean, would you use 6 weeks as just kind of like extra? Those 2 weeks would be extra game prep to get ready for a season opening game that you have against West Virginia, or do you think it'll be sort of, hey, we weren't able to get spring in, let's use some of this time to instill some of the fundamental stuff that we're not able to go over or weren't able to go over?
I would use, because this is what I'm sure he doesn't want to change his philosophy much. I would use those 2 extra weeks in the front end, like if they're in July, if we get them, to just be an extension of spring practice.
Yeah.
And then start preseason practice when you would have normally started preseason practice, because Mike Norvell has a whole plan for those. Was it 29 practices you get? 28? What'd you say, Aslan?
29.
I'm sure he has a whole plan for how he wants to use those 29 practices and when he wants to start focusing solely on West Virginia, how much is installed. So I think you use those 2 weeks just straight spring practice, except this spring practice, you have your entire roster. Instead of just a handful of early enrollees, you have every freshman that you recruited on your roster to go through the spring practice with you.
But you do have to be smart with it, because we always see in that between the second and third weeks of preseason camp, when the players are all talking about how we can't wait to start hitting on somebody else, and they just there's a dreariness, the dragging on, the repetition of camp. Now, if you make that 5 or 6 weeks, that's going to be, to Gene's point, it's going to put a lot of onus on the coaches to figure out ways to break it up, to not be so monotonous and such a grind to where you get diminishing returns.
Well, Aaron, I'm curious how they're going to, if they do the 6 weeks, are they going to mandate, they got rid of the old 2-a-days, they started splitting things up, staggering practices. I would imagine there's going to be some kind of mandate there, so they don't just, throw guys in. There's going to be some limits on that, but that's where, again, it goes to the coaching staff, some nuances. How do you mix things up? How do you keep things fresh? You take 2 or 3 days maybe in the middle of this thing and give some guys off, or do some lighter stuff and some film study. Maybe you go you go 2.5 weeks and you just do 4 or 5 days of just nothing but film study. Let's go back. Let's look at everything we've done. Let's get guys off the field. Let's refresh them. And then we'll go back and then we'll start doing our game prep for West Virginia. I mean, that's going to be unique, and we're going to see different programs are going to approach this differently.
I think, yeah. I mean, there's so many options they have available to them. I would imagine maybe they would even use a week to almost treat it like a in-season bye week, where you kind of even look ahead past maybe even West Virginia. Corey, I know you talked about that game ultimately is more crucial than Boise State, but with Samford's kind of sandwiched in there, maybe you can peek a little bit ahead to what you think Boise is going to present in week 3. But we'll find out in due time as we do await an official announcement for Florida State, which at the time of this recording, they have not come forth to say when they will actually be back to their practices. But again, Clemson, Louisville, and the ACC have announced June 8th will be their start dates, and all the schools in the SEC that we know of will also be back on June 8th as well. Plenty of recruiting news going on with Florida State as well. 2 commitments in the high school ranks they were able to get on Friday. They were also able to firm up the transfer of Fabian Lovett from Mississippi State. He went ahead and signed, so he's official. There could potentially even be another grad transfer in the mix for Florida State. So do check out warchant.com for the latest on all things FSU. For Gene, Ira, and Corey, I'm Aslan. Thanks for watching.